Hello, everyone. Today I have the lovely Lian Brook-Tyler on my podcast, A Neurodivergent Soul. And we had a great conversation about some similarities of the work that we do, a lot connected to the soul. She is a soul guide, psychospiritual teacher, shamanic healer, podcaster, and co-founder of the Wild Sovereign Soul. And she talked a lot about her upbringing, being very connected to the wild, having a fantastic relationship with her father. They traveled the world together. And the loss of her father actually activating a turning point within her life. She talked a lot about her sensory difficulties as a child, but not recognizing them, as so many of us neurodivergent souls have experienced. I hope you enjoy this episode, and there is much to learn about the growth that we might all experience as we turn from maybe a more corporate or business setting in our lives to actually finding what our soul purpose is and informing ourselves deeply about the story we hold. And then transforming that into the path that we're really here for. I certainly enjoyed listening to her, and she's actually invited me onto her podcast. So my story is shared on hers too, which I've actually posted on my website because it was it's just one of those great conversations where things start to flow. So I hope you enjoy it, and let me know. Lian, welcome to A Neurodivergent Soul. It's lovely to have you here. How are you?
Oh, lovely to be here. And the name of the podcast feels like such an invitation and a welcome in itself. So I'm very well. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So you are the founder of a sovereign, sovereign soul, wild
Wild,
sovereign
sovereign, sovereign.
soul. That's
Yes, don't
right.
forget the
Yeah,
wild.
yeah, fantastic. Tell me, what is wild sovereign soul about?
It's been somewhat of a labour of love and an epic journey in of itself, which I could take a very long time telling you, and I'll do my best to put it into a nutshell. So, my co-founder, business partner, and I, Jonathan Wilkinson, founded Wild Sovereign Soul, but it wasn't called that then, back in 2013. And at the time, we were both very deep into, I guess you could say, more sort of non-dual spirituality type of tradition and way of working and way of living. And then over the years, as our soul often does, it takes us in all these other twists and turns where you're like, this will do now. I'm quite happy with this. This is nice and convenient. And then it would kind of plunge, me into shamanism and him into something else. And so over the years, the work we do, so that's been our kind of personal journey. And of course, the work we do is an expression of that. So we've gone through all of these evolutions and incarnations and different names to finally what we have seen is bringing all parts of those different parts, almost like different parts in themselves, one of rewilding, coming back into connection with our wild body and the wild land. The way that humans evolved through most of human history with that deep interconnectedness with all things. So that wild part of our work is represented in the word wild. The actualizing of our sovereignty, really recognizing who we really are beyond that wounding and conditioning and ego, the way we'll get kind of pulled into what seems important to our culture rather than what's truly important. So that again was kind of a really important part of our journey, that we recognize like this is important. This recognition of our own sovereignty is so important. And then lastly, although really it's the point of all of it, that awakening of the soul, which isn't a kind of one-off wake up and, as you know, this is the work and the path, that coming home to the soul is represented in that soul part of the word, which is also a connection to whatever word one has for spirit, God, the divine, all there is. And so those different strands and paths that we've journeyed on and guided the people that have been called to work with us in one way or another have finally come together in Wild Sovereign Soul, which feels so good to finally say, because again, it's felt like a long, twisting, turning journey to finally arrive here. I think this is, my hope is, the final evolution in terms of what we call ourselves, but I suspect there is so much more to unfold.
There's always growth, isn't there? No matter who
Yes.
or what we're doing, it's always there and it's always necessary. Hey,
Yeah. The only certainty is change, it seems.
absolutely. So, what does soul mean for you?
Gosh, I mean, this absolutely could be the whole podcast and beyond. um, Interestingly, when I first was called off the path that I was on, there was a real divergence of the path I had been on, which was very much kind of finding how can I fit into this mainstream world. I'd had actually a very, very different upbringing, which we may or may not touch upon, but I'd had a very unusual upbringing for this culture, but then had, for whatever reason, decided, no, I can win at this. I can do this mainstream world. I can make myself into the shape that makes a success of myself in a way that this culture tells me is a success. So at this point, going back to 2012, I'd ticked all of those boxes. I had the family, the career, the house, everything that was kind of like tick, 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 done it. And
Mm.
yet there was something at the heart of it that I always felt, what is it? What's missing? What's it I'm looking for? I don't even know what it is I'm looking for, which, that would help. And then my father died, and then I was suddenly plunged into a whole other reality, a whole other path.
Mm.
So the reason without going into kind of focusing there too much, the reason I'm saying this is I didn't really have this concept of even there being a thing called soul. Of course, we talk about this idea of soul, people use the word soul, but I didn't have any sense of embodied knowing of soul, but that began to wake up. But because I then was drawn on into a path of spirituality that didn't really focus much on this notion of soul, it was still a number of years before I started to have some sense of there is something really important, as well as this connection to all there is, as well as this sense of us being, as Rumi put it, that drop in the ocean. The drop itself is, there is the ocean and there is also the drop, that unique fractal of consciousness that we've come to live in this lifetime.
Mm. Mm.
And it has its own unique aspects, its own unique path, its own ways of expressing, its own ways of relating, its own ways of connecting to all there is. And that's taken me time to it's funny, isn't it, how our soul itself takes us on the path of knowing what our soul is. That as kind of, I wouldn't say I have the full picture of what does soul mean, but that's where I've got to at this point. That's what soul means to
Right.
me, and I guess simply put, it's that unique aspect that is absolutely intrinsically connected to all there is, but there is something vital, something unique, something important in that drop that we each are too.
Mm. Nice. So, what were you doing then before 2012? What was that world that you talk about that you tried to fit into? Because this is so many people's journey,
Mm.
so many people's stories, isn't that? Trying to fit into something other than who we truly are. What was it you were trying to do?
And do you mean specifically in terms of my work, or kind of what did the
Yeah.
texture of my life look like?
Yeah, I think your work and why did you get drawn to that, do you think specifically?
Mm. So I can, as often is the case, when we connect the dots looking backwards, even in the most seemingly mundane, soulless life, often there's still clues of like, yes, my soul was still trying to speak to me.
Mm.
And so I'd I'd done varying kinds of jobs and also had sort of these like full starts to have career changes. And I can now see they did all involve some form of creativity, some kind of devotion to beauty, some way of bringing things into being that were an expression of something deeper. And I didn't know that at the time. So, simply put, everything I was ever doing had something to do with design. And
Okay.
so, or like that expression of beauty, of something like that. So my main career was actually in website design. And so I
Okay.
worked for a big corporate
Right.
looking after their web presence, in short.
Yeah.
That was the last job that I was doing when all of this happened. But I'd also had these kind of, again, like these full starts where I trained in interior design. I was like, maybe that's the thing I'm looking for. And so I trained in interior design, and I love houses. I love that just the expression of beauty in a house.
Yeah.
And then of course I came up against the same things that I kept coming up against. It's sort of reduced to numbers and money and these things that don't actually call to my soul. So I was like, maybe that's not it. I then got drawn into retraining as, I guess you could say, like a personal stylist, but focusing on kind of archetypes and colors, like how you might have House of Color or Color Me Beautiful, where you're looking at that person and seeing, what would be the most aligned expression of them physically. As you can see, there was something in
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
I've ended up that was kept trying to call me like, no, it's not that, but it's something deeper than that.
Yeah.
And so, in short, the point at which my father died, I was I say, I'd actually made a real success of my career. It was somewhat fulfilling because I did have this creative
Mhm.
aspect.
Mm.
Um, I was a leader of people and actually really enjoyed working with people, and again, very similar to what I do now, really seeing what is it that they're being called to. What are those possibilities
Mm.
within them that haven't yet been called upon? But it was, of course, within this multinational corporate. I was trying to, again, be like, so the idea is to have this like perfect house and perfect family and all these things that I had managed to do. And I look back and I think it's actually incredible that I'd managed to do that, because not knowing at the time, I was and am autistic, have various other neurodivergencies, had like incredible sensory sensitivities where certain environments would really have me kind of shut down and struggle. And I was also at the time suffering from chronic facial pain, panic attacks from a traumatic incident 15 years earlier. So I had all of this kind of that I was somehow managing to, it was like, if it was like a duck on water, my legs were going crazy under the water, but
Mm.
the duck part looked perfect. She had it
Yeah.
all together. She was doing a great job. So,
Mm.
yes, that's what I was doing.
It's so interesting because every one of those skills that you were learning back then has complemented the work you do today, hasn't it? Really, and honestly, I
Yes,
mean,
yeah.
the skills that you must have had from website design, from being involved with technology, to running a podcast now. So there's a lot there, isn't there, that you could gain some influence from and support and resource for your work today, creating a business yourself. So there's never anything wrong, is there, with what we do in the past? It's all there for a
Mm,
reason, and I think that's part of the soul journey, isn't it? That it leads us along the paths that we actually need for us to grow and learn, even if they're very difficult paths, and they don't
absolutely.
quite fit with what our beliefs might be or what we feel is really important for us. So yeah, it sounds like you had a lot of that. And before that, when you were a child, what were you like growing up?
Well, it was so funny because, of course, you've now come on and guested on my show, and
Indeed.
so we had the opportunity to talk about your childhood, and there was so many similarities. It was like,
Yeah.
my goodness, she could be talking about my childhood right here, and so I'm sure much of what I share will be very familiar. So I I was raised by a single father. My parents met when they were very, very young, and I think both in their own way, sort of escaping their upbringing in different ways. My mum had a very difficult upbringing, lost her mum when she was 11, and was sort of looking for safety and security in my father was, I see now, clearly autistic, very, very bright, had been almost like hothoused, like you're going to go on to do great things. Ended up doing a degree in maths and physics, and then just like crashed and burned, well, in some ways he crashed and burned, from like, again, from a modern mainstream perspective, he crashed and burned. I think what actually happened is he kind of found his true path. So he and my mother were kind of products of that, and kind of gravitated towards each other, but weren't really meant for each other, couldn't really sustain it. So when I was 5 and my sister was a baby, they broke up. And for, I think my father and I had such a strong bond, I wasn't able to just stay with my mother and be happy. I just had this such a strong longing to be with my father, who also inconveniently had this really strong wanderlust. So, cutting a long story short, I went to live with him, and then we went traveling. So we were literally kind of had nothing. We were, apart from what we could carry on our backs. We were hitchhiking, spent time in Morocco, Ibiza, the south of France. He would pick up work where he could. He had a lot of different talents. He was a really good artist, musician, could teach. So he was kind of picking up work where he could, also homeschooling me, and just living this very kind of just throwing ourselves at life and seeing what would happen.
Mhm.
And then, so that was the context I was growing up within. And I had such, and I still do, such a deep love of animals. That's been true right from as long as I can remember. And even as I say, you can probably hear there's emotion in my voice. It's the kind of, and I wonder now, looking back, whether this is true for many autistic people. There is a kind of sense of like home that I find when like it's just there's just something at that deep level that just feels so true being with animals. So um and even as we were traveling, obviously I couldn't have, companion animals in the way that I do now, but I would always be having, wherever I was in the south of France. Funny enough, it came up in conversation the other day because my son had a cricket that just was on his shorts and wouldn't come off. And he said it had a kind of like prickle on its bum, and it took me back to the time in south of France, and I had this incredible cricket that I spent like 2 days just with, fascinated by this huge green and black striped cricket with this huge thorn on its bottom. And I literally spent, I say, I don't know how many days with it, tracking it, watching it. So even when I couldn't have, dogs and cats like I could if we lived in a house, I would always have these times where I'd just be so immersed in the world of an animal. Another time we lived in Devon, and I look back at this and I was like, there's something that tells me about myself that I still don't feel like I've fully grasped. But I found a mole that had died. And I mean, my goodness, a mole in itself, what a creature. It's like the creature of fairy tales. It's like, like it's the little spade like hands. And it doesn't look like it was made for this world. And so I found this mole and I was just entranced by it. But it had been, and of course, they've got this like beautiful velvety fur, but it'd been covered by fly eggs. Because obviously, I don't know how long it had been laying there dead. And so flies had laid their eggs on it. I spent an entire day just there devotedly removing the fly eggs from this mole. And then eventually, when it was free of fly eggs, I then buried it in this kind of little ceremony. That was a whole day of my life devoted to this dead mole. And so that probably tells you something of I was like. And then again, similar to you, I was so entranced by stories of fantasy and other worlds. My father played Dungeons and Dragons with me, where he'd create these incredible worlds that we'd immerse ourselves in, and they were so real. They seemed like as real as what we call real life. I'd be writing plays for my sister and my cousin, where we'd kind of perform these plays together, and so it just felt like that was real life, this immersion in this kind of world that to me then was as real as this one. And it wasn't until I then went we almost like came back to the normal world, and I went to secondary school, and it was just like my two worlds just collided, where everything I was being shown was this other world I'd known was, I don't even know quite the word, like not real, not true, not important, ridiculous, not of worth. And I've got these kind of clear moments where for example, my father was a real musician, so we'd often write songs together, sing songs together, and I have a memory of writing this song about wild horses, and like bless my little heart. So in like the first year of secondary school, going in and singing this song to my friends, you can imagine how that was received. Bless my heart. But I was still so innocent, so kind of alight with the wonder of everything, that it took those experiences for me to realize, like, oh, that's not how people are. That's not how most people see, think, live, love. And so hence, as I say, I went about kind of creating, like, so who do I need to be to make sense in this world? I can do that. And so I did that.
What did it change in you, do you think? What was the effect of that in your life?
It created the mandala that you and I spoke a lot about in our last episode, and I know that you've really devoted your life to, has been coming to mind as we've been talking, where it felt like there was this split that happened where my inner world stayed as rich and alive and as magical as that.
Mm.
I recall, particularly in those teenage years, where I felt this part of me, this new aspect of me being created, where I learned how to be charming, how to have people think that I was a kind of, I don't know, sensible person, a real person. And then at the same time, I had this really rich inner world. I remember spending days upon days trying to teach myself how to move objects with my mind. And so I would still, or spending days, painting a dead ancestor's portrait, for example. So I was still, I spent tons and tons of time. I didn't have horses myself, but I volunteered to work at some stables and also a kind of animal sanctuary place. So I'd still have all of that going on, but it was hidden. And then there was this other part of me that was acting as though none of that was happening. None of that was real. I wouldn't talk about it. I'd realized this is something that makes no sense to most people. So it just didn't show up in I kind of like practice how to speak and live in this kind of like shallow way,
Yeah.
where you just talk about boys and makeup and I don't know what pop stars are hot at that time. And the funny thing is, and again, we can so see, connect those dots looking backwards, because I have such a natural inclination for beauty and creativity. I absolutely fell in love with makeup. For me, it became this like just an art form of how to initially, I guess, like create myself, but then express myself. So I became very good at doing the things that had me fit in, but
Mm. Mm.
thankfully there was this kind of expressive element that I managed to find within it too. And so it, yeah, I look back and I was like, that's what it did to me. It created this split that have really only started to come back together in those years since my father died, where I
Right.
can, it's not that that new version of me I created isn't at all true and has no meaning, but there is something about bringing those two parts into union that I can now see has been the work of these years.
Right. Yeah. It must have been quite a challenge to have gone from backpacking, not knowing where you were going half the time, and hanging out there with your father, to coming home and then, or coming back, and then being in that structured way of living. I could imagine that being very challenging for a child. How long were you living that way?
It was a year that we were traveling abroad. Then we were moving from place to place. So we spent another, I don't know exactly, a year or 2 years living in, I don't know if you'd call it a commune. It kind of a small commune, I suppose. And so even when we were not living kind of like completely close to the ground, we weren't living in kind of what you'd call normal circumstances.
Mm.
And then when we finally were living in normal circumstances, even that wasn't like, we'd often have people staying with us. I remember we used to, where my friends would go, I don't know, on a package holiday to Spain for a week in the summer. We'd go to like the festivals, like we would, go to Glastonbury Festival, and then I'd come back to school and feel like I don't know how to talk to them about this. It's probably best I don't. And so even when even when we were sort of, again, finally living somewhat of a normal life, it was nothing like any of my friends, nothing at all. And yeah, I think that I sometimes wonder if we'd stayed living a kind of our, whatever you want to call that kind of way of living that we had lived, how I would have become, would I have created this other version of me? But then what would I have done then after? I mean, obviously our story is our story, and it happened the way it did. But I remember when that film, I think it's called Captain Fantastic. You
Oh
know the
yes,
one?
I know
Yeah.
that was,
When that
yes,
came
yeah,
out, people who know
yeah,
me were just like, "Have you seen that? That's like your childhood, your father right
yeah,
there."
yeah, yeah.
And it was, my life was a kind of less dramatic version of what happens to them. And so I
Right.
think they re-entered the mainstream world a bit later than I did, but I don't think there's a way of escape. I think at some point we're going to meet this world and then discover who we are.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I love that film. I think that's one of the
Yeah.
favorite films of all time, really. Not
I
that
think
it
I need to
didn't have
rewatch
its,
that with my children, actually. I don't think I've watched it with them.
not that, I mean, it had its own issues and challenges and problems, didn't he, in that? But yeah, very, very beautifully done. And so you've gone through this time in your life, and you've been through the school system. Did you know you were autistic then, or is this a much
No,
later
no, no
thing?
clue. So I, at some point, and I think this is the thing, it's if it's the water you're swimming in, and for so many of us,
Mm,
one or both of our parents are neurodivergent, almost always, aren't they? So
yeah,
it becomes
yeah,
just normal.
yeah.
My father was very eccentric, but also very charismatic. So he had his, like, some real quirks, but everyone loved him. So it kind of, I didn't really see the cost of being autistic, or the fact that
Mm,
it wasn't welcome or normal, because it was just what I'd been used to. And
yeah.
so at some point I realized I was probably dyscalculic, because he was so good at maths and I was really capable in every other way, but when it comes to numbers, um it's like they just don't seem to have a place in my mind to sit neatly. And so if I can do maths, but just day to day trying to work with numbers is really challenging for me. Like, I will make mistakes all of the time. When I try to say to someone, "Oh, we're doing such and such at this time," I won't notice, but I will put the wrong number in, even when I think I've sat there and really focused on putting the right number. So I've had this like really odd relationship with numbers, that I started to realize, hang on, I seem to be fairly intelligent in every other way, and this is really basic stuff. Um, there's something different about the way that I am with numbers that isn't explained by the fact that I'm just stupid or just not good at maths. And again, because I had the contrast of my father being like exceptionally good, it was like there's something here that explained. Then I discovered this word dyscalculia, and I was like, that's what it is. And it was actually a real relief because it's like this explains it. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just a thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I can really relate to that because I know I'm pretty sure I'm dyscalculic and I skip over numbers constantly, cannot do maths at all. And yet I'm always counting things.
how interesting.
Always counting. I could be somewhere. I was on the train yesterday. I had to count how many seats are on the train carriage, how many this, that, and the other, how many people, and until I've counted everything, then I find it's a
It's like
way
I'm
of
here.
yeah, it's a way of
Yeah.
settling something, I think. But no, I'm so like you. If there's dates in something I'm reading, I just straight over them. Cannot register the date.
Mm.
It's funny that, yeah.
Yeah. So I knew that about myself quite early on because it was such a stark contrast to my father. It was
Mm.
like a helpful, like there's something. And then
Mm.
I just accepted that that's who I am.
Yeah.
And then and I think again, I think this is a fascinating thing. I thought for a long time that neurodivergent people and perhaps particularly autistic people are a bit like the canaries in the coal mine for our culture, where what doesn't work for us actually doesn't work for any human. It's just that
Mm.
we are much more sensitive to it not working. And
Mm.
so I look back at my wild childhood where we, had so much time in nature without bright lights and horrible smells and horrible, sensory things that would be a problem for me. And so they didn't
Mm.
show up for all of that time because they were very rarely present.
Mm.
Then, as I began to have experiences that were kind of much more this modern world and
Mm.
started to realize, like, if I go into a restaurant now, thankfully my family are so just honouring of this,
Mm.
where I will need to sit in a certain place where the lights aren't too bright. I can't sit with the air conditioning kind of like blasting on me. I can't sit somewhere where there's a funny smell. I can't sit somewhere where it feels like there's too much kind of energy going back and forth near to me.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
it could be the whole restaurant just doesn't do it for me because the colors are too clashing. So it's really in this modern world that there's all of these things where suddenly I'm the problem, and I don't know about that. And then it was when I did my shamanic training, it was in the woods, and of course, so it was devoid of all of the usual kind of modern
Yeah.
conveniences, like no electricity, no this, no that. We were camping. The kind of most high tech we got was being in a yurt, and I was just like, oh, of course, like none of my usual sensory sensitivities show up here. Isn't that
Yeah.
interesting? I'm back in the way that humans evolved in for most of human history. Funny how I don't seem to have all of these sensory sensitivities here. Interesting
That
that.
interesting. That is very
So
interesting.
yeah, so I started to realize that I had all of these sensitivities, but for some, I think, as you probably know, for so long we had this very um, small view of where there was kind of like autism that was kind of over here, and was the more, when you think of kind of non-speaking kind of autism. And then we had Asperger's, which was this kind of very like Rain Man. It was only really men, and they'd be really good at maths and into trains or something. And
Mm.
so it didn't seem at all relevant or anything to do with me, I suppose. It just wouldn't even cross my mind.
Mm.
um and so I don't know really how I made sense. I think I just thought, this is the way I am. I'm just very sensitive. Um,
Mm.
and then I can also look back at all these kind of social, really confusing things that happened. Um, but I suppose also this is a good because I'd had such a strange upbringing. I guess I must have thought, oh, I don't understand things because it's not how I've been brought up. I suppose there may have been that kind of rationale. Like when someone says this, I'm just going to take them at the word. I'm not going to guess that they actually mean this over here, because that's not how I've been brought up, to kind of second guess and think that people aren't just going to say the thing they mean. So I guess that's what I must have assumed. So in short, no, I had no clue.
But a sense of something different. But then you've been
Yes.
brought up so different in any
Yeah.
case that why wouldn't you
Of
experience
course,
something
I'd be
like that?
different. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely, absolutely. And do you say you have a good relationship with your family? We haven't heard much about your mother and your relationship with her. How was that, not living with her, not growing up with her, and your sister, I think it was?
Yeah. So we, they made, I guess I don't think they consciously made this as a choice that would end up being a final choice, but they made the choice for me to go with my father and my sister stay with my mum. So we
Right.
were brought up separately.
Mm.
And so I, it's interesting. Both my parents have passed now, so it's not like I can, talk to either of them now about their feelings. But I did a bit when I was older, and I think for my mum it was incredibly hard. Again, thinking about the upbringing she'd kind of created this family, hoping for the very stability and security that she'd had, and then she didn't even have her daughter with her, which normally if you separate, you would at least have your children, wouldn't you? And again, we weren't even often even in the same country. So she found it incredibly hard. We also struggled to, we didn't have an easy connection. I think because I'd had such a strong bond with my father, and was just very different to her. I think there was this challenge for us to be able to easily relate. And so is when we would be together, often there'd be friction, and I'd feel kind of like as if she was sort of emotionally manipulating me, even when perhaps she wasn't. It was just, I found that really hard to be around, like this energy I didn't really understand. And at the same time, I was, as is often the case, it seems, with autistic women, I was a real tomboy, to the point where I'd be mistaken for being a boy. And I think a combination of that that separation of my parents, going to live with my father, seeing that my mother in a way was a kind of victim to that. I'm not saying she was a victim or that is true, but in my mind at the time, almost like, just this
Mm.
sort of like lack of agency, this just being at the mercy of men and the world. At somewhere I'd made this choice of like sort of women. I don't think I would have said it like this, but like women, girls, the feminine is just something I don't want anything to do with. And so I had also had that going on, where I had this like deep wound around all things the feminine. Um, and so that I think wasn't really about my mother. That was about something much, much deeper, but was showing up in my relationship with my mother. But of course, it was really showing up in relationship with myself. And so that took really until, again, these more recent years, as I've been understanding myself and kind of who I really am, and that relationship with the feminine, that's as it's turned out to be one of my sort of deepest devotions, actually.
Interesting.
um, that really started to heal that relationship we had. Not necessarily, I mean, she had her own path and her own problems. And so, not necessarily at that kind of very obvious material way of looking at a relationship, but at that deeper sense of like peace and acceptance of, like, I had towards her at least. And as I often reflect upon, we often think that relationships are sort of done when someone's died, and I can report that that's not true. My relationship with both my mother and father since their deaths has only deepened, has only allowed me to kind of see more, be more compassionate, and so yes, it definitely was a very challenging relationship, which has gone through so much healing. And I see now, again, had so much more to do with me and the wounding I had within myself than it really had to do with her.
Very interesting. It sounds like a real catalyst for your own, for that healing and for the knowledge you now have on the feminine and
Mm.
how you hold that kind of space maybe for others now as well.
Yes, it's so much part of my work now, which
Right.
if you'd told me that however many years ago, I would not, that is probably the part of the work that I do now that I would have been most just, I don't even think I would have been able to laugh. I would just been like, are you absolutely mad? Like there's no one on earth that's what what I end up doing.
Fascinating. I love those kind of stories though, that you know, that deep wound on one level was actually what
Mm.
led you to offering what you do now. That's such an important observation for us to have in our own lives, isn't it? That
Oh yes,
the biggest
so
challenge is
often the medicine's
often,
in the wound.
yeah,
Mm.
exactly. It's what we call the wounded healer, isn't it?
Yes.
And so, what are your hopes now for Wild Sovereign Soul? Where do you see that developing and growing with all your story and all the resources and trainings you've done? What's happening now with it?
So we are right now in fact, it's funny because Wild Sovereign Soul, in terms of the name, came from the work that Jonathan and I were doing maybe a year or so ago, where we were looking at all of the work that we do, all of the ways that we work with people, all of the different traditions, methodologies that we use, and distilling it into, okay, it feels like now we're at a point where we can distill this into a path. And so he and I were working on that and then started to see these strands I spoke about, this strand of wild, sovereign, and soul. And so we were looking at, how they sort of weave together. They're not separate. They're very much kind of weaving together in this path of the work we do, which is why we then said, like, do you think we're actually meant to be called Wild Sovereign Soul? This is so inconvenient. We don't want another rebrand. Oh my goodness. Like, please, no. And so we tried, particularly me, to do everything other than just accept,
What
like, that is,
what were you called before?
well, we had to say various iterations, but most recently be mythical.
Oh, be mythical. Oh, right.
Yes.
Right.
So we'd and that had only been maybe 2 years prior to that. If you want to know what we were called before that, it was Waking the Wild. So you can see,
As our work grows and develops,
it's,
I mean, I was alchemy and movement for years, and then it was
it's
very clear.
fascinating, isn't it? The names
Yeah,
that are so
yeah,
right at the time, so capture who we are at the time.
yeah,
So
yeah.
in fact, I may as well tell you all of the names we've been, because you'll see a pattern. So the first one was Born Happy, which was talking about that kind of innate happiness at the kind of
Mm,
like the deep spiritual level. So that was the first one. Then it was Primal Happiness, which was starting to bring in this understanding of rewilding, like coming back to
mm,
that, human animal, as it were.
mm,
Then it was Waking the Wild, which was coming back to the wildness of our souls, of that way of living, of our true self. So it was kind of like starting much more to go in the direction that we're talking about. Then we became Be Mythical, because we were just so in, I have such a deep love of archetypes and stories. And so it was like, that feels as though ultimately this is all about living our own soul's myth.
mm.
And so that felt really right. And then again, coming back to where we were a year or so ago, we weren't intending to change the name. We were just intending to honor the work that we do, and sort of distill it and articulate it more clearly than we had. And these three strands, Wild Sovereign Soul, kept emerging and saying, this is the work, you do, this is what you need to honor. And to the point where we're like, oh no, not another change. And then finally, like, submitted to it. And so what we're doing right now is going, like, now obviously that's taken some time, energy, money, and everything to get to this point. So we're now actually retracing our steps to an extent to pick back up the work that we were doing that started all this, to articulate who we are, what we do, the path that we take people on, these strands, how they show up, how you can, for example, actualize your sovereignty. And we're now kind of back facing that and seeing how do we create that in a way that we can share with the world, in short. So yeah, another spiral back around.
but all of it relevant, all of it's, accessing those deep human parts of us that,
Yes.
in a way, it sounds like Wild Sovereign Soul incorporates much of that anyway. It's just the
Yes.
wholeness of it. Yeah.
Yes, it's like we've got now the name, and it's just now being able to
Yeah.
say to people, this is what we're talking about when we're saying
Mm.
wild sovereign soul. This is what that
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. And it's all that you've lived through and accumulated and resourced yourself with, that you can now offer back to others. So what would people find themselves doing if they came to one of your, what are they, workshops or gatherings
We
or?
we do all kinds. We have private clients that we work with one to one, often over years. Probably much like yourself, how it's so interesting, isn't it? Seeing
Mm.
someone's journey. The more they listen to
Mm.
their soul, the places that takes them. So we work with people again over months and then often years. In that way. And then we also run, usually online, various kinds of courses, either together or I sometimes do ones particularly for women on my own, and Jonathan will do the same for men. We also do some in-person work, like for example, for me, I might do shamanic healings or ceremonies. Jonathan also runs Vision Quest. He lives in Ibiza, so he'll run Vision Quest on wildland in Ibiza. But coming back directly, I think that answers your question quite well. At the moment, we are guiding a group of around 25 people through the Wild Sovereign Soul pilgrimage. And this notion of pilgrimage really spoke to us, with the idea that that is really the path of soul. It is a pilgrimage where it's not a one and done. We'll kind of keep being called back deeper and deeper, seeming sometimes to cover the same territory, but we're in this deeper spiral. And it's not just a course that you do once, it's a pilgrimage that you take over and over again with devotion. And so we are working simultaneously with the idea of this being a pilgrimage home to soul. It's a 3-month pilgrimage. Again, all online, but of course the invitations are taking people kind of like, I don't know, out into their local land to be with a tree, those kind of things. And each month so is divided up. So we've got the first month that we've just finished around all things reclaiming their wildness. Second month, right now we're in actualizing their sovereignty. The final month, awakening their soul. And then it's also interspersed with working with their Chiron placement astrologically, which maps to their wounded healer. And so which I find I love. It's funny that you mentioned the wounded healer earlier. It's one of my favorite archetypes. I'm absolutely obsessed with the wounded healer. So when I offered to do this, I didn't know there'd be 25 people, but I distilled each person's Chiron placement in the natal chart to give them this like invitation, like this is what's here for you to work with during our pilgrimage. So it's like this is very specific to your soul compared to the wider pilgrimage you're all on. And then again, I found myself like spending days doing all of these distillations because there were so many of us. So we're going really, and what it's revealing, even, well, for myself and Jonathan, but people have been deep in the work for many years. There is something about the door that this is opening that is so fascinating. It's
Wow.
taking us to some really interesting places. So that's an example of the kind of work we do.
Sounds fascinating. Yeah, beautiful. Great work, hey? Yeah, so what would you say to our listeners now? Is there any words of wisdom or ideas or something that you can send them away with to ponder on from this conversation? What would you say to them?
What occurs to me is something, yes, no, not yesterday, it's Thursday. Today, Tuesday, was our guidance circle in the pilgrimage where the soul pilgrims will bring requests for guidance as to where they're on the journey, and then Jonathan and I will meet them in that. And what kept showing up on Tuesday, and you often see this, don't you? There's kind of like if we journey as a circle or as a group, we have the same things starting to arise for many of us at the same time.
Mm.
And what kept coming up, and I was like, this is actually such a human thing, actually, where we have this North Star of our soul. And at some point on our journey, that may not be clear what that is. There is, looking at my own story, for many years, I didn't even know there was a North Star. I was looking to even know that there was a North Star. And then at some point, through, an act of God, or, in my case, my father dying, which could also be seen as an act of God, I guess, we start to get that hint, that sort of glimmer behind the clouds of that North Star of soul. And then as we devote to following it, it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer. The challenge is, even after that point, we can lose sight of it. We can dismiss it. We can get really busy with other things that kind of, we're looking at that analogy of it being a North Star. We can be like sort of, looking down on the ground and, organising what sixth form our child's going to, which is what's going on for me at the moment with one of my children. Or I don't know, making sure we've got a shopping delivery, and all of these things, need attending to and are important, and yet they can have us distracted from that North Star. And so if I were to offer anything, and this is something I'm kind of offering and reminding myself all the time, it's just to pause and see where on that journey are you. I suspect for people listening to this show, they already do have a sense of their North Star. I don't think they were like me back in my corporate days. I imagine they almost all already have a sense of that North Star of their soul, the form it takes, what that calls from them, what that requires of them. And where might they be not fully devoting to it, not paying attention to it, not giving it the energy that is really asking of them? And one final thing that's linked to this, what I notice over and over again, if you say to someone, what's all this for? What would you die for? Even if perhaps we wouldn't actually die, because, hey, we've got children and dogs to feed and stuff, we might not actually die. But there's something about that question that we know the answer, like it just merges out of us. And my sense is that is what we've come here for. That's what our soul came here for. We know it. But then the next question is, are you living for that? Are you really living for the thing you would die for? And the places that it's like, maybe not. No, not fully. That's where the work lies.
There you go. Wow, beautiful. That's great. I love that. Yeah, definitely got a clear idea of what my North Star is, and definitely devoted to it. So yeah, try and fit
Yeah,
everything in healthy
would you
around it.
share? I'm sure you've shared this plenty of times before, but given it feels like a lovely way to close this. Would you share for you what that is? Like if you were to say
It,
what your
well,
North
it,
Star
it
is.
yeah, it's absolutely soul work and helping people to wake up to the light that's deeply within them. And as part of that, it's helping myself to do that, to really
Mm,
finding that soul spark. So I'm utterly fascinated with that journey, and that's the journey I take people on in my own courses and workshops and the like. So yeah, can we be who we truly are here to be? What is our
yes,
God-given right in being here? So yeah, I think we're definitely in line with each other on that one. Yeah, and
absolutely.
I resonate a lot with your story. So bless you. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today. And I hope our listeners, well, I know our listeners will find this a fascinating topic. So bless you.
Oh, my pleasure entirely. What a precious conversation. Thank you so much.